For 10 years, the wife of a billionaire had never been seen at a single one of his parties. The sentence moved quietly through Manhattan's upper circles like an elegant rumor, repeated in low voices over champagne glasses and beneath crystal chandeliers, because in a city where power and wealth were displayed like priceless art, absence was often more mysterious than presence. On a cool autumn evening, the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel shimmered with gold light as hundreds of New York's most influential investors, executives, and socialites gathered to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Whitmore Global, a company that had grown from a small financial consulting firm into one of the most powerful multinational investment groups in the United States. Waiters moved gracefully between marble columns carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne, while a soft jazz trio played near the towering windows overlooking Park Avenue. And everywhere people spoke about the man who had built the empire being celebrated that night. Daniel Whitmore was a name that carried weight in every financial publication from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, a man described as brilliant, disciplined, and almost impossibly composed. At 38 years old, he had already achieved what most executives spend a lifetime chasing, commanding boardrooms with calm authority and negotiating deals worth billions of dollars with the quiet precision of a chess grandmaster. Yet there was one small detail about his life that fascinated the media even more than his business success. Daniel Whitmore, according to every magazine profile and television interview, appeared to be a single man. His photographs showed him standing alone at international conferences, charity galas, and luxury events across the world, always perfectly dressed in tailored suits, always calm, always surrounded by powerful people, but never by a spouse. What those magazines never printed, what the cameras never captured, was the truth that behind the gates of a quiet estate in Westchester County lived a woman whose life had been connected to Daniel Whitmore for an entire decade. Naomi Carter Whitmore stood in front of a tall bedroom window as the final glow of sunset stretched across the gardens outside, the soft golden light brushing against her deep brown skin and reflecting gently in the glass. The house she lived in was breathtaking in its size and beauty, a modern stone mansion resting on 3 acres of carefully designed landscape with tall maple trees and a small lake that shimmered in the distance. Yet for Naomi, the silence inside its walls often felt heavier than the luxury that surrounded her. 10 years earlier, when she had first met Daniel Whitmore, she had believed she was stepping into a life filled with possibility. She had been 26 then, working as a graduate research assistant in international linguistics at Columbia University, fascinated by the power of language to shape diplomacy, business, and global cooperation. Daniel had been a rising investor at the time, sharp-minded and ambitious, but not yet the billionaire the world would later admire. Their meeting had been simple and unexpected, 2 strangers introduced during a university economic symposium where Naomi had volunteered as a translator for visiting European guests. Daniel had watched her move easily between conversations in French, German, and Italian with effortless confidence, and afterward he had approached her with the quiet curiosity of someone who recognized rare talent. Within a year they were married in a small private ceremony attended only by a handful of friends, a moment Naomi remembered not as extravagant, but as sincere, filled with quiet promises and hopeful plans for the future they would build together. Yet shortly after the wedding, Daniel had asked for something unusual. He explained that the business world he was entering was complicated, that investors often judged executives not only by their performance, but by their image, and that maintaining a certain level of privacy around his personal life would help him avoid unnecessary distractions. At first, Naomi had accepted the explanation with understanding. She believed in Daniel's ambitions and admired the discipline that drove him to work 16-hour days building Whitmore Global into what it would eventually become. So when invitations arrived for corporate galas, charity fundraisers, and international business events, Naomi stayed home while Daniel attended alone. The pattern repeated quietly year after year until it became an unspoken rule inside their marriage. Daniel never asked Naomi to accompany him, and Naomi eventually stopped asking why. Outside their home, the world saw Daniel Whitmore as a powerful man without attachments, a figure whose life appeared perfectly controlled and uncomplicated. Inside the mansion, Naomi filled her time reading, studying, and occasionally assisting Daniel behind the scenes by reviewing international correspondence, or helping refine translations during negotiations with foreign partners. Her ability with languages had quietly shaped several key agreements Whitmore Global had signed in Europe and Asia, but her name never appeared in press releases or public acknowledgments. To the world, she did not exist. On the night of Whitmore Global's anniversary gala, the ballroom in Manhattan sparkled brighter than ever as journalists and investors waited eagerly for Daniel Whitmore to arrive and deliver the speech celebrating 2 decades of success. Conversations flowed easily through the crowd, but one curious observation continued to circulate among guests who had attended Daniel's events for years. Someone finally voiced it aloud near the champagne bar with a laugh that carried through the room. "You know something strange?" the man said, glancing around the ballroom with amused curiosity. "In 10 years of Whitmore Global parties, I've never seen Daniel Whitmore's wife." The comment lingered in the air for a moment before disappearing into the soft music and laughter of the evening. But somewhere many miles away in Westchester County, Naomi Carter Whitmore stood quietly beside her dresser, holding an envelope that had arrived earlier that afternoon. The elegant black card inside carried the golden emblem of Whitmore Global and a line written in careful script that made her heart pause for the first time in years. It was an invitation to the anniversary gala, and for reasons Naomi could not yet explain, she had decided that tonight she would finally go. Naomi Carter Whitmore remained still for a long moment after opening the envelope, her fingers resting lightly on the thick black card as if the elegant gold lettering might disappear if she moved too quickly. The Whitmore Global emblem shimmered beneath the soft lamp beside her dresser, a symbol she had seen printed on contracts, reports, and international correspondence for nearly a decade, yet never on an invitation addressed to her. Outside the window, the sky had darkened into deep blue twilight, and the quiet lake beyond the garden reflected the first stars appearing above the trees. The mansion felt unusually silent that evening, the kind of silence that made small thoughts echo louder than they should. Naomi read the invitation again slowly, the words steady and formal, inviting distinguished guests to celebrate 20 years of corporate achievement at the Astoria Crown Hotel in Manhattan. Normally, she would have set the card aside without another thought. For 10 years, that had been the rhythm of her life. Invitations arrived, Daniel attended alone, and Naomi remained in the quiet comfort of their home, where her presence created no questions and no complications. Yet tonight something inside her felt different, as if the quiet patience she had carried for a decade had finally reached a gentle turning point. She walked toward the wide mirror beside the closet and studied her reflection carefully. Naomi Carter Whitmore had never been interested in extravagant fashion or the glittering world of high society. Her beauty had always carried a calm, thoughtful elegance shaped by intelligence rather than attention. Her dark eyes held the steady focus of someone who spent years studying languages, diplomacy, and the subtle ways communication shaped power between nations. When Daniel first met her at Columbia University, he had once joked that Naomi could probably negotiate peace between 3 countries simply by translating their misunderstandings correctly. That ability had quietly followed her into their marriage. During the early years of Whitmore Global, when Daniel was still building his reputation with international investors, Naomi often sat beside him late at night reviewing proposals written in French or German, sometimes translating entire conference calls when business partners from Europe or Japan struggled to communicate with Daniel's team. She never appeared in photographs, and she never attended meetings. Yet several of Whitmore Global's earliest global partnerships had been guided by her calm explanations and carefully chosen words. Daniel always thanked her with quiet sincerity when those negotiations succeeded. At least in the beginning he had. Naomi placed the invitation carefully on the dresser and walked slowly through the bedroom toward the large wardrobe near the window. The closet doors opened to reveal rows of neatly arranged clothing, most of it simple and understated, colors chosen more for comfort than attention. She reached toward the back of the rack where a garment bag had remained untouched for several years. The zipper slid open with a soft sound, revealing a deep crimson evening dress she had purchased long ago during a brief moment of hope when she believed Daniel might one day ask her to attend an event beside him. The fabric shimmered gently under the warm bedroom lights, elegant but not extravagant, designed to carry confidence rather than spectacle. Naomi brushed her fingers across the material and smiled faintly at her own younger optimism. For many years she had told herself that patience was a form of strength. Daniel had responsibilities, expectations, and a world of pressure that most people could not understand. She believed supporting him quietly was part of the partnership they promised each other when they married. Yet standing there now, with the invitation resting behind her and the city celebration unfolding only 30 miles away, Naomi felt the quiet realization that support did not have to mean invisibility. In Manhattan, the ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel had grown even brighter as more guests arrived, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting across polished marble floors while the orchestra shifted from jazz to a slower instrumental arrangement that floated through the room like warm evening air. Daniel Whitmore had just stepped onto the stage near the center of the ballroom, greeting executives and investors with the composed confidence that had become his signature. Cameras flashed briefly as journalists captured the moment, eager to document the man who had built Whitmore Global into one of the most influential investment firms in the country. Standing near Daniel was Victoria Hale, a polished social figure whose presence at recent Whitmore events had quietly attracted attention in business columns and lifestyle magazines. Victoria spoke easily with investors and smiled gracefully toward the cameras, her presence beside Daniel reinforcing the image many people had already accepted as truth. Yet while the ballroom celebrated Whitmore Global's success, a black sedan quietly pulled through the gates of the Westchester estate. Naomi Carter Whitmore stepped outside into the cool night air, carrying the invitation in her hand as she looked once more toward the quiet house behind her. 10 years of silence rested within those walls, years of patience, loyalty, and quiet intelligence that few people beyond Daniel had ever witnessed. Naomi closed the car door gently and gave the driver a calm instruction. "Take me to Manhattan." Tonight she would step into a room where the world believed she had never existed. The black sedan moved smoothly along the quiet highway toward Manhattan, its headlights cutting through the cool autumn night, while Naomi Carter Whitmore sat calmly in the back seat watching the distant skyline grow brighter with every passing mile. The city lights stretched across the horizon like scattered stars, reflecting against the dark surface of the Hudson River as the driver guided the car south along the familiar route that Daniel had traveled thousands of times over the past decade. Naomi rested her hands gently in her lap, the elegant invitation still folded between her fingers as if it carried a quiet weight that could not be ignored. For 10 years she had remained outside the world Daniel occupied every day, a world filled with boardrooms, investors, and glamorous events where powerful people gathered beneath crystal chandeliers and spoke confidently about billions of dollars as if they were discussing the weather. She had never complained about that distance. Instead, she had studied quietly, continuing her research in international linguistics and global negotiation strategies, reading economic reports late into the night, and refining her understanding of the cultural patterns that influenced how nations and corporations formed alliances. Naomi believed that language was more than communication. It was a bridge between intentions, a tool capable of transforming tension into cooperation when used with patience and intelligence. Daniel once admired that belief deeply. She could still remember the nights when they sat together at the long dining table inside their Westchester home, reviewing international proposals. Daniel would slide documents across the table toward her, sometimes written in German or French or Japanese, asking quietly, "What do you think this partner is truly asking for?" Naomi would read slowly, studying not only the words but the tone hidden between them, and then she would explain the deeper meaning behind the language, helping Daniel understand whether the proposal was cautious, ambitious, or quietly strategic. Several of Whitmore Global's earliest international partnerships had begun during those late-night conversations. Yet as Daniel's success grew larger and the company expanded across continents, the world around him also changed. Investors demanded polished presentations. Journalists wrote stories about the brilliant young executive building a financial empire. Invitations arrived for global conferences and elegant celebrations. Somewhere within that growing spotlight, Naomi's presence gradually faded from Daniel's public life until she existed only behind the gates of their home, while his reputation expanded across magazines and television screens. The sedan crossed the George Washington Bridge and entered the rhythm of Manhattan traffic, where yellow taxis, private drivers, and delivery trucks moved together beneath glowing billboards and towering glass buildings that reached toward the night sky. Naomi watched the city with a quiet sense of familiarity. She had studied in New York for nearly 8 years before marrying Daniel, and the energy of the streets still felt alive and inspiring. The kind of place where ideas and ambition flowed through every neighborhood like electricity. The driver turned south toward Midtown, where the Astoria Crown Hotel stood proudly along Park Avenue, its elegant stone entrance illuminated by golden lights that reflected across polished black cars arriving one after another. Security staff and hotel attendants moved efficiently along the curb welcoming guests dressed in formal evening wear, while cameras occasionally flashed from the sidewalk, where journalists hoped to capture images of powerful executives attending the anniversary celebration. Inside the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore had just finished greeting several international partners when a tall investor from Tokyo approached him with a polite smile and a respectful bow. The conversation shifted naturally into English as the man praised Whitmore Global's success in expanding investment networks across Asia. But soon a subtle challenge appeared when several of the investor's colleagues began speaking rapidly in Japanese while discussing potential expansion opportunities. Daniel listened carefully, but the complexity of the discussion slowed the conversation, forcing one of the assistants nearby to attempt a hesitant translation that lacked the nuance necessary for serious negotiation. Victoria Hale stood beside Daniel, observing the exchange with a composed expression, her presence adding elegance to the scene as she greeted other guests with graceful confidence. At that same moment, the black sedan, carrying Naomi Carter Whitmore, turned onto Park Avenue and stopped smoothly in front of the Astoria Crown Hotel. A hotel attendant stepped forward immediately and opened the door with professional courtesy. Naomi stepped onto the sidewalk and looked briefly toward the towering entrance where warm golden light spilled from the lobby windows onto the street. The cool autumn air carried the distant sound of music from inside the ballroom, along with the quiet hum of conversations from hundreds of guests already gathered within. Naomi adjusted the crimson dress gently at her shoulders and walked toward the entrance with calm, steady steps. Several guests glanced toward her with quiet curiosity, noticing the elegance of her presence even though no one recognized her name. For the first time in 10 years, Naomi Carter Whitmore was about to enter the same room where Daniel Whitmore had built his public life, and neither Daniel nor anyone else inside the ballroom had any idea that the invisible woman they had never met was now only a few steps away from the celebration. Naomi Carter Whitmore stepped through the tall glass doors of the Astoria Crown Hotel and entered a world that had existed beside her life for 10 years, yet had never once included her presence. Warm golden light filled the grand lobby where marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers suspended nearly 30 feet above the polished reception area. The quiet elegance of the hotel carried the familiar scent of fresh flowers and polished wood, and somewhere deeper inside the building, soft orchestral music drifted from the ballroom, where Whitmore Global's celebration continued to unfold. Naomi paused only briefly near the entrance, allowing the moment to settle gently around her. Guests moved confidently through the lobby in formal evening attire, men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant gowns that shimmered beneath the warm lighting. Their conversations calm and assured in the way that often accompanies great wealth and influence. For many of them, this evening was simply another prestigious gathering in a long calendar of events. For Naomi, it was the first time she had stepped inside a world that had quietly shaped her marriage from a distance. A hotel attendant approached politely with the composed professionalism that came from years of welcoming influential visitors. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to the Astoria Crown." Naomi returned a calm smile and presented the black invitation card that still rested in her hand. The attendant glanced down at the gold lettering and immediately stepped aside with a respectful nod. "The Whitmore Global Gala is taking place in the grand ballroom on the second floor. Please enjoy the celebration." Naomi thanked him softly and walked toward the wide staircase that curved upward along the marble wall, like a quiet invitation to another level of the evening. Each step carried her closer to a place where Daniel Whitmore had built his public life for an entire decade. Upstairs, the entrance to the ballroom stood open beneath tall white columns decorated with soft arrangements of white orchids and silver ribbon. Two event coordinators welcomed arriving guests with practiced smiles, while a soft glow of music and conversation spilled from the enormous room beyond the doorway. Naomi paused at the threshold for a moment and looked inside. The ballroom stretched across nearly half the floor of the hotel, a breathtaking space illuminated by dozens of crystal chandeliers that scattered golden reflections across polished floors and tall mirrored walls. Round tables draped in white linen filled the room, while servers moved smoothly between guests carrying trays of sparkling drinks. At the center of the ballroom, a small stage had been arranged where Daniel Whitmore had spoken earlier in the evening, celebrating 2 decades of Whitmore Global's rise from a modest consulting office to an international financial empire. Conversations drifted easily across the room as investors discussed new opportunities and executives exchanged greetings with old partners. Naomi stepped quietly inside, and the sounds of the celebration surrounded her at once. No one recognized her name, and no one questioned her presence. To them, she was simply another elegant guest attending a prestigious corporate gala. A few people glanced briefly in her direction, noticing the calm confidence in her posture and the deep crimson dress that moved gracefully as she walked, but their attention quickly returned to their conversations. Near the far side of the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore stood beside a group of international partners, while Victoria Hale listened attentively with a poised smile. The earlier conversation with the investors from Tokyo had grown more complex as additional guests joined the discussion, their voices shifting occasionally into Japanese while they examined the possibilities of expanding Whitmore Global's influence deeper into Asian markets. Daniel listened carefully, maintaining the composed focus that had earned him respect across the global financial world. Yet the rapid exchange of language created small pauses where translation struggled to keep pace with the discussion. Naomi observed the group quietly from across the room. For years, she had watched negotiations like this unfold from a distance through documents and late-night conversations at home, analyzing the meaning behind each word and cultural nuance that shaped the direction of international partnerships. Standing there now, she could already hear the subtle misunderstandings forming within the conversation, small differences in interpretation that could easily delay a promising opportunity if left unresolved. She moved calmly through the crowd toward the refreshment table where several guests stood speaking in French about a recent European investment conference. Naomi greeted them politely and responded in the same language with natural ease, her accent smooth and precise from years of academic study and professional practice. The men exchanged surprised smiles, clearly impressed by the effortless fluency of a woman they had never met before. A few moments later, a guest from Berlin joined the group, and Naomi welcomed him in German, just as comfortably, her calm voice weaving easily between languages as if the conversation required no effort at all. Across the ballroom, the investors from Tokyo continued their discussion with Daniel Whitmore, unaware that the quiet woman speaking elegantly in several languages near the center of the room was the same person who had once helped Daniel understand those cultural subtleties years before Whitmore Global ever entered the international spotlight. The conversations near the refreshment table gradually grew more animated as several European guests realized the quiet woman in the crimson dress could move effortlessly between their languages without hesitation. Naomi Carter Whitmore listened carefully as a French investment advisor described new energy infrastructure projects being discussed in Paris, and she responded with thoughtful precision, her voice calm and measured as she explained the economic challenges such projects often faced when negotiating cross-border financing. The advisor's eyes widened with impressed curiosity because Naomi's observations were not the polite comments of a casual guest. They carried the analytical depth of someone who understood the mechanics of international agreements at a professional level. Within minutes, their conversation expanded to include a German venture partner and an Italian technology investor, each of them surprised to discover that Naomi could follow their shifting languages without a single pause. Her tone remained warm and respectful, yet the intelligence behind her words quietly reshaped the discussion as they began asking her questions about trade regulations, translation nuances, and the cultural expectations that often influenced negotiations between American and European corporations. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore continued his conversation with the delegation from Tokyo, while the music from the orchestra softened into a slower arrangement that allowed voices to carry more clearly through the room. The investors spoke carefully, their expressions thoughtful as they described a new financial partnership that could expand technology investment across several Asian markets. Yet despite Daniel's calm professionalism, the dialogue remained slightly strained because the translator assisting them struggled to capture the subtle tone of several key phrases being exchanged. What the translator presented as cautious hesitation was actually polite interest in Japanese business etiquette, and the difference between those two interpretations carried significant consequences for the direction of the conversation. Naomi could hear the distinction immediately from across the room. She had spent years studying exactly these kinds of cultural subtleties, learning that international agreements were rarely shaped by vocabulary alone but by the intentions hidden beneath it. She excused herself politely from the group of European investors and walked calmly toward the center of the ballroom, where the discussion between Daniel and the Tokyo delegation continued to unfold. None of them recognized her as she approached. To them, she was simply another guest moving through the celebration with quiet confidence. One of the Japanese executives had just spoken again when Naomi paused beside the group and listened carefully to the translator repeat the statement in English. The translation softened the meaning too quickly, removing the respectful nuance that signaled serious consideration rather than doubt. Naomi waited for a brief moment of silence before speaking gently in fluent Japanese. Her voice carried the calm clarity of someone completely comfortable with the language, and the effect was immediate. The executives from Tokyo turned toward her with visible surprise as Naomi restated the original comment with greater accuracy, explaining that the proposal had not been rejected but was being evaluated with traditional caution that required patience and detailed discussion. The difference transformed the atmosphere of the conversation instantly. Several of the executives nodded with appreciative smiles, clearly relieved that someone had recognized the true intention behind their words. Naomi continued speaking in Japanese for another moment, clarifying the cultural context of the negotiation and suggesting a more appropriate phrasing that would signal Whitmore Global's respect for the partnership being offered. The discussion shifted smoothly after that, the tension dissolving into a more collaborative tone as both sides recognized they were finally understanding each other correctly. Daniel Whitmore stood very still during this exchange. At first he had listened with mild curiosity, assuming the elegant woman speaking beside them was simply another multilingual guest with an interest in international finance. But as Naomi continued translating the conversation with remarkable precision, he began to recognize something deeply familiar in her voice and the thoughtful cadence of her explanations. The realization reached him slowly, like the quiet turning of a key inside a locked door. For 10 years, Naomi Carter Whitmore had remained invisible to the world surrounding his company, a presence known only within the privacy of their home and the quiet assistance she once provided during the early stages of his career. Yet here she was standing in the center of the Whitmore Global Anniversary celebration, speaking Japanese with the same calm intelligence that had once helped him build his first international partnership. The Tokyo investors were smiling now, clearly impressed by the clarity she had brought to the negotiation. One of them turned toward Daniel with respectful interest and asked a simple question in English. "Mr. Whitmore, may we ask who this remarkable translator is?" The ballroom seemed to pause for a brief second as Daniel Whitmore looked directly at Naomi Carter Whitmore for the first time that evening. The question from the Tokyo investor lingered in the air with a quiet weight that seemed to soften the music and slow the movement of the room around them. "Mr. Whitmore, may we ask who this remarkable translator is?" Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately. For a moment, he simply looked at the woman standing beside the investors, the warm light from the chandelier reflecting softly against the deep crimson fabric of her dress and the calm confidence in her posture. Naomi Carter Whitmore returned his gaze without tension or hesitation. There was no accusation in her expression, no anger, only the quiet steadiness of someone who had finally stepped into a place she had once been asked to avoid. Around them, several nearby guests had begun to notice the unusual conversation unfolding between the Japanese delegation and the unknown woman whose fluent translation had just reshaped the discussion. Victoria Hale also turned slightly toward Naomi, curiosity forming behind her carefully composed smile. Daniel cleared his throat gently before responding, his voice controlled in the same calm tone that had guided countless negotiations during his career. "This is Naomi." The simple answer hung briefly in the air, yet it felt incomplete even as he spoke it. One of the Japanese executives tilted his head politely, clearly sensing that Daniel's introduction carried more meaning than the single name suggested. Naomi offered a gracious nod and continued speaking in Japanese, explaining that she had spent many years studying international linguistics and business diplomacy at Columbia University. Her words carried the respectful cadence expected in formal Japanese business culture, and the executives responded with visible appreciation for the clarity she had brought to their conversation. One of them bowed slightly before addressing Daniel again. "Mr. Whitmore, your colleague has a remarkable understanding of cultural communication. It is rare to meet someone who interprets not only the words, but also the intention behind them." Daniel hesitated for a brief moment before replying, because the truth of that statement was something he had known long before Whitmore Global ever hosted a celebration like this. "Naomi has always had that talent," he said quietly. Victoria stepped closer beside him then, her voice polite but curious as she looked at Naomi with a thoughtful expression. "I do not believe we have met before. Are you part of the Whitmore Global International Relations team?" Naomi turned toward her with the same calm grace she had shown throughout the evening. "No," she answered gently. "I am not part of the public team." Her response was brief, yet carried a subtle weight that a few nearby guests immediately noticed. The Tokyo investors were now speaking again, asking Naomi several questions in Japanese about negotiation etiquette and long-term partnership customs between American corporations and Asian technology firms. Naomi answered each question clearly, shifting occasionally between Japanese and English so that Daniel could follow the full discussion without interruption. With each explanation, the atmosphere of the conversation grew more collaborative, the earlier tension dissolving into genuine interest about future investment opportunities. Several guests standing nearby had begun watching the exchange with quiet fascination, whispering softly to each other about the elegant woman whose language skills seemed to command the respect of the international delegation. Daniel remained unusually silent during these moments. His attention stayed focused on Naomi as she spoke, recognizing the familiar intelligence in her voice that had once guided his earliest global negotiations long before Whitmore Global appeared on the front pages of financial magazines. He remembered evenings when she sat beside him translating entire business proposals, helping him understand the unspoken cultural expectations hidden inside each agreement. That memory carried an unexpected sense of humility as he watched the room slowly begin to recognize the same remarkable abilities he had once known in private. One of the Japanese executives finally smiled warmly and addressed Naomi again in English. "Your insight has helped us understand this partnership far more clearly. We hope Mr. Whitmore appreciates the extraordinary advisor he has with him tonight." The statement drew a few approving nods from others nearby. Victoria glanced briefly at Daniel with a faintly puzzled expression, sensing that the evening had taken a direction she had not anticipated. Naomi responded politely to the executive with a graceful smile. "I am happy to help when communication becomes complicated." Daniel took a slow breath then, understanding that the question asked moments earlier had not truly been answered yet. The investors were still waiting politely, and now several other guests had turned their attention toward the small circle forming around the conversation. Daniel looked again at Naomi Carter Whitmore, the woman who had shared his home for 10 years while remaining invisible to the world celebrating his success tonight. The quiet truth stood clearly between them, waiting for him to finally speak it aloud. The quiet expectation from the Tokyo investors remained suspended in the air as Daniel Whitmore stood beside Naomi Carter Whitmore beneath the glow of the crystal chandeliers. Around them, the conversations in the ballroom had softened slightly, as if the room itself sensed that something important was about to be said. Daniel understood that the moment was no longer only about business diplomacy. It was about truth, a truth he had avoided speaking publicly for 10 years. He looked once more at Naomi, noticing the same calm intelligence in her eyes that had once guided him through the earliest stages of building Whitmore Global. For years, she had helped him understand the world beyond American boardrooms, quietly translating not just languages but cultures, expectations, and intentions that shaped international partnerships. Yet tonight was the first time anyone in this ballroom had seen her standing beside him. Daniel straightened slightly before answering the question that had been asked. Naomi is not simply a translator, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. She studied international linguistics and diplomacy at Columbia University, and she has advised me on cross-cultural negotiations since the early years of Whitmore Global. The Tokyo investors exchanged impressed glances, clearly recognizing the importance of someone with that level of expertise. One of them nodded thoughtfully and spoke again in English. Then you are fortunate to have such an advisor close to your company. Daniel paused again, realizing that even this explanation was still incomplete. The quiet weight of the truth remained between him and Naomi, waiting to be acknowledged. Around them, several nearby guests had now turned their attention fully toward the conversation. Victoria Hale watched closely as well, her composed expression beginning to show the faintest trace of uncertainty. Naomi stood calmly beside Daniel, offering no interruption, no pressure, simply allowing the moment to unfold in its own time. The music from the orchestra drifted softly through the ballroom, a slow piano melody echoing beneath the golden lights as Daniel finally continued speaking. Naomi Carter Whitmore is also my wife. The words were spoken in a steady voice, but their effect spread through the nearby guests like a quiet ripple across still water. For several seconds no one spoke. The Tokyo investors looked at Naomi again with new understanding, their expressions shifting from curiosity to respectful recognition. One of them bowed his head slightly before speaking. Then we are honored to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Naomi returned the gesture with graceful composure, answering politely in Japanese that the honor was mutual. The calm elegance of her response carried the dignity of someone who had waited many years for this moment without resentment. Around the circle of guests a low murmur began to form as the significance of Daniel's introduction slowly reached others nearby. Several executives who had attended Whitmore Global events for years glanced toward Naomi with surprise, realizing they had never once seen the woman Daniel had just described as his wife. Victoria stood very still for a brief moment before stepping forward with a carefully measured smile. Daniel, I did not realize you were married, she said lightly, though the slight tension in her voice was difficult to hide completely. Daniel answered calmly. It was always a private part of my life. Naomi turned toward Victoria with the same composed grace she had shown throughout the evening. It is a pleasure to meet you, she said gently. Victoria nodded politely, though her attention quickly returned to the group of investors as the conversation resumed around them. The Tokyo delegation continued discussing the partnership proposal, now addressing Naomi directly several times as they clarified details about communication strategy and cultural expectations for future negotiations. With Naomi's guidance, the discussion flowed smoothly, the earlier uncertainty replaced by mutual confidence between both sides. Daniel listened carefully as Naomi explained certain diplomatic customs that could strengthen trust between Whitmore Global and its Asian partners. Watching her speak with such clarity reminded him how much of his early success had quietly depended on her insight. For the first time that evening, the guests around them were beginning to see Naomi Carter Whitmore not as a stranger in a crimson dress, but as someone whose intelligence carried real influence within the world Daniel had built. And as the conversation continued beneath the warm lights of the ballroom, the invisible boundary that had separated Naomi from that world for 10 long years was finally beginning to disappear. The conversation with the Tokyo delegation continued to unfold with a new rhythm now that Naomi Carter Whitmore stood among them. What had begun as a slightly uncertain negotiation was gradually transforming into a genuine discussion about long-term collaboration, and several guests nearby were beginning to notice that the quiet woman Daniel Whitmore had just introduced as his wife possessed a remarkable ability to guide international dialogue with calm authority. Naomi listened carefully as one of the executives explained a proposed partnership between Whitmore Global and a Japanese technology consortium specializing in artificial intelligence research. When he paused, she responded thoughtfully in Japanese, clarifying that successful cooperation between American and Japanese firms often depended not only on financial structure, but also on mutual respect for each side's decision-making culture. Her words were precise, yet warm, balancing professional insight with cultural sensitivity in a way that immediately strengthened the tone of the conversation. The executives nodded appreciatively as she spoke, recognizing the rare skill of someone who understood the deeper rhythm of their language rather than simply translating vocabulary. Daniel observed the exchange quietly. For years he had known Naomi possessed exactly this ability, yet watching the investors respond to her tonight made him realize how invisible that strength had remained to the world around him. Nearby guests had begun to gather subtly closer, drawn by curiosity as they overheard fragments of the multilingual conversation drifting through the room. A French venture partner who had spoken with Naomi earlier leaned toward a colleague and whispered with impressed amusement that the mysterious Mrs. Whitmore seemed to speak half the languages of Europe. Naomi finished answering a question from the Japanese delegation and then smoothly transitioned into English so the broader group could follow the discussion. She explained that international negotiations often failed not because of financial disagreement, but because small cultural misunderstandings created hesitation between partners who might otherwise trust each other. Her explanation carried the clarity of someone who had spent years studying global diplomacy, and the guests listening nearby exchanged thoughtful glances as they realized the depth of her knowledge. One of the Tokyo executives smiled warmly and said that Whitmore Global was fortunate to have someone with such perspective. Naomi responded politely that good communication was often the most valuable investment any company could make. Victoria Hale remained beside Daniel during this exchange, her expression still composed yet increasingly reflective. She had attended countless events with Daniel during the past several years and had grown accustomed to the admiration he received from investors and executives alike. Yet tonight the attention was slowly shifting toward Naomi, whose presence seemed to reshape the atmosphere of the entire gathering without any effort to command the spotlight. Victoria studied Naomi carefully for a moment before addressing her with a gracious smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, your understanding of international culture is quite impressive." Naomi inclined her head slightly in appreciation. "Thank you. I believe language can reveal much about how people think and how they choose to build trust with one another." As the conversation expanded, the group gradually moved toward one of the nearby tables where several guests from Europe joined them. Naomi greeted them easily in French before continuing the discussion in English so that everyone present could follow the exchange. Within minutes, the table had become a small circle of international voices, the kind of spontaneous dialogue that often sparked new ideas and future partnerships. Daniel listened to Naomi explain how certain negotiation customs differed between American and Asian corporations, noticing how naturally the guests responded to her calm explanations. There was no sense of performance in her manner, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the subject deeply. Across the ballroom, more guests were beginning to notice the conversation forming around Naomi Carter Whitmore. Some recognized her name from Daniel's introduction earlier, while others were hearing about her for the first time through the respectful remarks of the Tokyo delegation. What had begun as a private corporate celebration was gradually becoming something more interesting, a moment when people realized that the woman who had remained unseen beside Daniel Whitmore for 10 years possessed a voice capable of shaping the very conversations that defined his global business empire. And as the warm light of the chandeliers reflected across the room, Daniel Whitmore found himself watching Naomi with a new awareness. Understanding that the evening he had once planned as a celebration of Whitmore Global might quietly become something else entirely, a moment when the world would finally discover the brilliance he had kept hidden beside him for far too long. The quiet circle of international investors surrounding Naomi Carter Whitmore continued to grow as word of the extraordinary conversation traveled gently through the ballroom. What had begun as a small exchange between the Tokyo delegation and Daniel Whitmore had now drawn the attention of several executives from Europe and North America, each curious about the elegant woman whose calm intelligence seemed to guide the dialogue with effortless clarity. Naomi stood beside the round table beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, answering questions with thoughtful precision while shifting naturally between languages whenever the discussion required it. One moment she was speaking English about international contract structures. The next, she was clarifying a French executive's question in his native language, and moments later she responded to a German investor with a polite explanation about regulatory cooperation between American and European financial institutions. The transitions were smooth and unforced, as if language itself simply followed the rhythm of her thinking. Several guests listened with growing admiration. It was rare in rooms like this to encounter someone whose knowledge extended beyond financial strategy into the deeper cultural understanding that allowed global partnerships to succeed. Daniel Whitmore remained quietly observant at the edge of the circle, his attention fixed on Naomi in a way that felt different from the earlier part of the evening. For years he had known exactly how sharp her mind was, how carefully she studied the complex patterns of international communication that shaped modern business diplomacy. Yet tonight, he was witnessing something new. The room was beginning to recognize her brilliance on its own. He watched as a venture capital executive from London leaned forward with curiosity and asked Naomi how she had developed such precise fluency in multiple languages. Naomi answered simply that language had always fascinated her because every culture revealed its priorities through the words it valued most. In her studies, she had discovered that diplomacy often depended less on financial leverage than on understanding how different societies expressed respect and trust. The answer resonated with several people listening nearby, and one of the Tokyo investors smiled warmly before adding that her interpretation earlier had preserved an important nuance in their conversation with Whitmore Global. Victoria Hale stood beside Daniel with a composed expression that now carried unmistakable thoughtfulness. She had spent years moving comfortably through rooms like this one, understanding how power and reputation shaped every conversation. Yet she could sense the subtle shift taking place tonight. Guests who had originally gathered around Daniel were now directing their questions toward Naomi, recognizing the rare intelligence behind her calm presence. Victoria glanced briefly at Daniel and spoke in a quiet voice meant only for him. "I can see why the Tokyo delegation respects her insight." Daniel nodded slightly, without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are beginning to understand what I learned years ago." At the center of the conversation, Naomi had just finished explaining how certain Asian corporate negotiations often required longer trust-building phases before financial commitments could be finalized. Her explanation helped the American executives at the table understand why patience in international partnerships could often create stronger long-term results. The Tokyo investors responded with appreciative smiles, clearly recognizing that Naomi had accurately described an important element of their own business culture. A few moments later, a senior executive from a large California technology firm spoke, with visible curiosity. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your understanding of global negotiation strategy is remarkable. Have you ever considered working directly within international advisory roles?" The question created a brief, thoughtful pause around the table. Naomi answered calmly that she had spent many years studying and assisting quietly behind the scenes, focusing primarily on research and communication analysis. She explained that her work had always centered on helping others understand the meaning behind complex dialogue rather than seeking attention for herself. Her response carried no bitterness, only quiet honesty about the path her life had taken. Several guests nodded with renewed respect. In a room filled with powerful personalities and ambitious voices, Naomi's composed humility stood out in a way that felt both refreshing and quietly powerful. The orchestra began playing a gentle piano arrangement that drifted through the ballroom like soft evening air, while servers continued circulating with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Yet even as the celebration continued, the attention of many guests remained drawn toward Naomi Carter Whitmore. For the first time since Whitmore Global began hosting these annual gatherings, the most compelling conversation in the room was not centered on Daniel Whitmore's financial empire, but on the extraordinary intelligence of the woman who had quietly stood beside him for 10 years without the world ever knowing her name. And as the evening continued beneath the golden lights of the Astoria Crown Ballroom, Daniel Whitmore slowly began to understand that the event he had planned to celebrate his own success was quietly transforming into something far more meaningful, a moment when Naomi Carter Whitmore was finally stepping into the recognition she had long deserved. The warm glow of the chandeliers continued to reflect across the marble floor of the Astoria Crown Ballroom, as conversations slowly shifted around Naomi Carter Whitmore, the quiet center of attention that many guests had not expected to discover that evening. The music from the orchestra drifted gently through the room, a smooth piano melody blending with the soft murmur of voices discussing new partnerships, international markets, and the remarkable woman who had just guided a complicated negotiation with calm precision. Naomi stood beside the round table with the same composed grace she had carried since arriving, answering questions thoughtfully while maintaining the quiet humility that had always defined her character. Several executives from Europe and Asia were now engaged in a lively exchange about the future of technology investment and cross-border cooperation, and Naomi listened carefully before offering a thoughtful observation about how cultural expectations often shape the pace of innovation partnerships between countries. Her explanation was clear and insightful, drawing appreciative nods from those gathered around her. One of the Tokyo investors smiled warmly before addressing Daniel Whitmore once more. "Mr. Whitmore," he said with genuine admiration, "your wife possesses extraordinary diplomatic awareness. Many companies spend years training consultants to understand these cultural differences, yet she seems to recognize them naturally." Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the compliment while watching Naomi with quiet reflection. He understood the truth behind the investor's words better than anyone in the room. Long before Whitmore Global became a multinational powerhouse, Naomi had been the one helping him navigate early conversations with international partners, patiently explaining the meaning behind gestures, phrases, and traditions that might otherwise have been misunderstood. Those early lessons had shaped the foundation of his global strategy, yet tonight was the first time anyone outside their home had seen her demonstrate that knowledge openly. Victoria Hale remained nearby with thoughtful composure, observing the growing admiration directed toward Naomi. She had always understood that the world of business events was built on influence and reputation, yet she could sense that Naomi's presence carried a different kind of authority. It was not built on image or presentation, but on genuine understanding. That realization created a quiet shift in the atmosphere of the evening. Another guest approached the table, a senior executive from a respected financial firm in Chicago who had been listening to the conversation from a short distance away. He introduced himself politely and asked Naomi how she had developed such a deep understanding of global negotiation dynamics. Naomi answered with the same calm sincerity she had shown throughout the evening. She explained that her academic research had focused on how language revealed the priorities and values within different societies, and that effective negotiation often depended on recognizing those values before attempting to discuss financial terms. Her explanation was both simple and profound, and the executive responded with a thoughtful smile. "That perspective," he said, "is something our industry could benefit from hearing more often." Around them, the ballroom continued to shimmer with light and celebration. Yet more and more guests were drifting subtly closer to the conversation surrounding Naomi Carter Whitmore. What had begun as a quiet exchange with the Tokyo delegation was now a lively gathering of international voices, each eager to hear her insights about diplomacy, language, and the human elements that shaped successful business relationships. Daniel noticed the way people listened to Naomi, how their attention shifted naturally toward her whenever she spoke. There was no effort in her presence, no attempt to dominate the room. She simply shared her understanding with clarity and grace, allowing others to discover its value for themselves. The realization stirred something reflective within him. For 10 years he had believed he was protecting their private life by keeping Naomi away from the public world of Whitmore Global events. Yet tonight he was witnessing how easily she belonged within this environment, not as a guest standing beside him, but as someone whose intellect could influence the very conversations shaping his company's future. Naomi glanced briefly across the room and met Daniel's eyes for a moment. There was no accusation in her expression, only quiet acknowledgement that the evening had taken an unexpected direction. She returned her attention to the guests around her as one of the European investors asked another thoughtful question about cultural diplomacy between American and Asian corporations. Naomi responded with patient clarity, describing how mutual respect and listening often created stronger partnerships than aggressive negotiation tactics. Her answer drew quiet laughter of agreement from several executives who had experienced those same lessons during their own international dealings. As the evening continued beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, it became increasingly clear that Naomi Carter Whitmore was no longer an invisible presence within Daniel Whitmore's life. The room was discovering her intelligence one conversation at a time, and with each passing minute the celebration of Whitmore Global's anniversary was quietly transforming into something more meaningful, a moment when the woman who had remained unseen for 10 years was finally being recognized not only as Daniel Whitmore's wife, but as an extraordinary mind in her own right. The atmosphere of the ballroom had shifted in a subtle but unmistakable way. Conversations that had once revolved around stock forecasts and investment strategies were now quietly circling around Naomi Carter Whitmore, the elegant woman whose calm intelligence had reshaped the tone of the evening without raising her voice or demanding attention. Beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, guests listened with genuine interest as she continued explaining the delicate balance between cultural respect and strategic negotiation in global business relationships. A venture capital partner from Boston leaned forward slightly and asked how companies could avoid common misunderstandings when entering partnerships with firms in Asia. Naomi responded thoughtfully that successful negotiations often depended on listening longer than speaking, because trust in many cultures was built gradually through consistency and respect rather than speed. Her words carried the steady rhythm of experience, and several executives nodded quietly, as if recognizing lessons they had learned the difficult way during past negotiations. Daniel Whitmore stood a few feet away, observing the scene with an expression that was more reflective than proud. For years he had believed that separating Naomi from his public business life was a practical decision, something that protected both their privacy and his carefully constructed reputation in the competitive financial world. Yet tonight the room itself seemed to be correcting that assumption. The people gathered here were not questioning Naomi's presence. They were drawn to it. A senior banker from Zurich spoke next, addressing Naomi with polite curiosity about whether she had ever considered publishing her research on diplomatic communication in global markets. Naomi smiled softly and answered that her work had always been more focused on understanding than recognition. She explained that knowledge was most valuable when it helped people communicate more clearly, and that she had simply followed her curiosity about how language shaped trust between cultures. The answer was simple yet thoughtful, and it carried the quiet humility that had defined her character for as long as Daniel had known her. Victoria Hale remained beside Daniel, her posture still poised, yet noticeably more reserved than earlier in the evening. She watched Naomi carefully as another guest joined the conversation and asked about negotiation customs between European technology firms and American venture capital groups. Naomi answered in calm English before shifting briefly into French to clarify a nuance in the executive's earlier comment. The ease of the transition drew a small wave of appreciative laughter from several listeners, who were beginning to realize that Naomi Carter Whitmore possessed a rare ability that no corporate consultant could easily replicate. She did not simply translate language. She translated intention. Daniel felt the quiet weight of that realization settle deeper within him. For 10 years Naomi had lived beside him with this same intelligence, offering insight whenever he asked for it, while remaining invisible to the world that benefited from her understanding. Now that world was finally beginning to see her clearly. The orchestra shifted into a brighter arrangement as servers circulated with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Yet many guests remained gathered near Naomi's table rather than returning to the dance floor or the bar. A respected international trade advisor from Washington spoke with visible admiration as he addressed Daniel directly. Mr. Whitmore, your company clearly benefits from remarkable strategic insight. You are fortunate that Mrs. Whitmore understands global diplomacy so well. Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the statement with a quiet honesty that had not been present earlier in the evening. Yes, he replied thoughtfully. I have always known that. Naomi glanced briefly toward him then, her expression calm but reflective, as if acknowledging the deeper meaning behind his words. There was no resentment in her gaze, only the quiet awareness that the evening had already changed something important between them. The guests around the table soon resumed their discussion about future collaborations, asking Naomi additional questions about how companies could strengthen international partnerships through clearer communication. Naomi answered patiently, describing how cultural patience and mutual respect often created stronger foundations than aggressive bargaining. Her explanations carried the kind of insight that came from long observation, rather than ambition, and the room responded with the respectful attention that genuine wisdom often commands. As the conversation continued beneath the warm golden light of the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore realized that the celebration he had organized to honor Whitmore Global's 20-year success had revealed something far more meaningful. The world was discovering Naomi Carter Whitmore not through reputation or publicity, but through the undeniable clarity of her mind. And in that quiet recognition, Daniel began to understand that the greatest strength beside him all these years had never needed the spotlight he had once believed necessary for success. The evening at the Astoria Crown had taken on a quieter, more thoughtful tone as the conversations surrounding Naomi Carter Whitmore continued to deepen. What had begun as curiosity had now become genuine respect. Several of the most experienced investors in the room had gradually shifted their attention away from the celebration itself and toward the calm, intelligent dialogue unfolding near the center of the ballroom. Naomi listened patiently as a senior international advisor from Washington spoke about the growing complexity of global technology partnerships. When he finished, she responded with thoughtful clarity, explaining that many negotiations became difficult not because of financial disagreement, but because both sides felt pressured to move faster than cultural trust allowed. She described how patience, transparency, and careful listening often created stronger long-term partnerships than aggressive competition. Her words carried quiet authority, and the surrounding guests nodded in agreement. The Tokyo delegation, who had first experienced her insight earlier that evening, smiled with visible appreciation. One of them addressed the group and said that in many Asian cultures the most respected negotiators were those who spoke the least but understood the most. Naomi inclined her head politely in acknowledgement. Daniel Whitmore stood nearby, watching this exchange unfold with growing reflection. The celebration had originally been planned as a formal recognition of Whitmore Global's 20-year rise in the financial world. Yet now the focus of the evening felt very different. Guests were no longer simply discussing profits or expansion strategies. They were discussing understanding, communication, and diplomacy, the very subjects Naomi had quietly devoted her life to studying. Daniel recognized that many of the partnerships Whitmore Global enjoyed today had been strengthened by the same insights Naomi was sharing now, even if the world had never known where that wisdom came from. Victoria Hale observed the moment with thoughtful composure. She had always understood influence within rooms like this one. Yet tonight she saw that influence could take a very different form than the polished image often associated with power. Naomi did not try to impress anyone. She simply spoke with honesty and understanding, and people listened. A respected European investor soon addressed Naomi directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "the perspective you have shared tonight could guide many companies through the complexities of international cooperation. Have you ever considered advising organizations beyond your husband's company?" The question created a brief moment of quiet interest around the table. Naomi answered gently that her focus had always been on learning and understanding how communication shaped human relationships across cultures. She explained that meaningful partnerships grew when people approached one another with curiosity rather than assumption. Her words resonated deeply with those listening. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances, clearly recognizing the value of her insight. Daniel listened carefully as she spoke. For years he had believed that protecting their privacy meant keeping Naomi separate from the public side of his professional life. Yet tonight he could see how naturally she belonged in conversations like these. Not as an accessory to his reputation, but as a voice whose perspective could influence the very future of global cooperation. Naomi turned slightly toward Daniel for a moment, her expression calm and reflective. There was no accusation in her gaze, no bitterness about the years she had remained unseen at events like this one. Instead, there was quiet understanding, as if she had always known that recognition arrived in its own time. Daniel felt an unfamiliar humility settle within him as he met her eyes. The room around them continued to glow with music, laughter, and conversation, yet he understood that something deeper had shifted during the evening. The people gathered here had discovered Naomi Carter Whitmore not through introductions or publicity, but through the undeniable clarity of her thinking. A few moments later, the orchestra began playing a softer melody as guests gradually returned to their tables and conversations. Yet even as the celebration continued, the memory of Naomi's voice and insight lingered in the room like a quiet echo. Several executives approached Daniel privately to express admiration for his wife's remarkable understanding of international diplomacy. Daniel thanked them politely, yet each compliment reminded him of the same realization. Naomi had always possessed this brilliance. The only difference tonight was that the world had finally been allowed to see it. And as the evening slowly moved toward its closing moments beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore began to understand that the most important success of the night was not the anniversary of his company, but the recognition of the extraordinary woman who had stood beside him in quiet wisdom for 10 years. The celebration at the Astoria Crown gradually softened into the gentle rhythm of a closing evening as the orchestra shifted into a final arrangement that floated through the ballroom like warm light. Conversations continued quietly among the guests, yet the tone of the room had changed in a way that could not easily be reversed. The story people would remember from this night was no longer only the anniversary of Whitmore Global. It was the discovery of Naomi Carter Whitmore. Several guests still lingered near the table where she had spoken earlier, continuing thoughtful discussions about international cooperation and cultural diplomacy. Naomi answered their final questions with the same calm sincerity she had shown throughout the evening, offering observations about how patience, curiosity, and mutual respect often built stronger partnerships than competition alone. Her words were not dramatic or forceful, yet they carried a quiet strength that many people in the room found deeply compelling. Gradually, the conversations began to wind down as guests prepared to leave, exchanging cards and polite farewells while the soft glow of the chandeliers reflected across the marble floor. The Tokyo delegation approached Naomi one last time before departing. One of the senior executives bowed respectfully and thanked her again for the clarity she had brought to their earlier discussion. He explained that the future partnership they had been considering now felt far more promising because both sides understood one another more clearly. Naomi returned the bow with graceful warmth and wished them success in their journey home. As they walked away, several other investors offered Daniel their congratulations, not only for the success of his company, but also for the remarkable insight his wife had shared with them that evening. Daniel thanked them politely, though his attention remained quietly focused on Naomi, standing beside the table where the evening's conversations had begun. For many years he had believed he understood success. He had built Whitmore Global from a modest consulting firm into an international financial force, negotiated agreements across continents, and earned the admiration of executives around the world. Yet tonight had revealed something more important than any business achievement. It had revealed the quiet brilliance he had once chosen to keep hidden. Naomi stepped away from the table and moved toward the tall windows that overlooked the lights of Park Avenue. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, glowing with the restless energy that had always defined New York. For a moment, she simply looked out at the skyline, the same skyline she had watched from afar during so many evenings when Daniel attended events like this alone. There was no bitterness in her expression now, only a calm sense of completion. Daniel walked over and joined her beside the window. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The reflection of the ballroom lights shimmered faintly across the glass, blending with the distant glow of the city outside. Finally, Daniel broke the silence with a quiet honesty that felt unfamiliar even to himself. "I should have brought you here years ago." Naomi turned toward him gently. Her voice was calm, carrying the same thoughtful patience that had shaped every conversation she had guided that evening. "Recognition cannot be forced, Daniel. People must discover truth when they are ready to see it." Daniel considered her words carefully. For 10 years he had believed he was protecting their private life by keeping it separate from the public world of business. Tonight had shown him how incomplete that belief had been. The world had not rejected Naomi. It had simply never been given the chance to know her. Naomi looked once more toward the city lights before speaking again, her tone warm but thoughtful. Tonight was not about proving anything. It was simply a conversation. Daniel nodded slowly. Yet the impact of that conversation had been unmistakable. Throughout the evening the guests had recognized something that no title or reputation could manufacture, the rare clarity of a mind devoted to understanding rather than ambition. The orchestra played its final notes as the ballroom began to empty, leaving only a few lingering guests exchanging quiet farewells beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers. Naomi Carter Whitmore turned from the window and walked calmly toward the exit beside Daniel Whitmore. This time she did not walk behind him or remain unseen. Beyond the walls of his public life, she walked beside him with quiet confidence, the way she had always deserved. And as they stepped out into the cool New York night, the city lights reflected softly across the street below, carrying with them a simple truth that many of the guests would remember long after the celebration ended. The greatest strength beside a powerful man is often the wisdom he once overlooked but finally learned to recognize.